Welcome to Conscious Corner. Today, I'm honored to welcome Dan Lukasik to the show. Dan is a lawyer, law professor, and nationally recognized mental health advocate who has spent over 2 decades bringing awareness to depression, anxiety, burnout, and well-being in the legal profession. His work has been featured in outlets like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and NPR, and he's the creator of Lawyers with Depression, a platform that has supported countless attorneys. He also serves as the New York State Wellness Coordinator for over 16,000 court employees. More recently, Dan is the executive producer of two deeply powerful PBS documentaries, My Brother Lost in Time, A Bipolar Life and Travels with George, a journey through depression, connection, and friendship. These films explore the impact of trauma, loss, stigma, and also the profound healing that can come through human connection. Dan, I'm really grateful to have you here, and also just want to take a moment to express my deep, deep gratitude for the kindness and care you showed me when you had me on your podcast for my very first interview. It meant so much to me, and I'm really so grateful to be back together with you.
Thanks for that kind introduction too, Courtney.
Sure, sure. So I'd love to hear what inspired you to create these two films and what felt most important for you to share through them.
Well, my brother and I, my younger brother, I'm the fourth of five children. My younger brother was the fifth and the last, so he was the baby in the family. He was a brilliant person in so many ways and a mindfulness meditation practitioner and teacher for some of his life, or actually a lot of his life. And we shared that in common because I also uh, did that and was interested in those things. My brother and I shared a deep love, but we also shared a history of trauma and mental illness. My brother with bipolar depression, bipolar disorder, and myself with major depression and anxiety. My brother lost his life to the illness about 3 years ago or so. And it was just a powerful, devastating loss to him, to me. And about a year after it, I was trying to write an article for my local newspaper about it was the 1 year anniversary about our relationship, and I couldn't seem to get it together to do it. And by a series of amazing coincidences, a independent filmmaker who's done a lot of work with PBS and other films read the story, and he wanted to meet for coffee, and we did at Starbucks. And I told him the story, and I said, listen, it's really nice you met me for coffee, but I don't have the kind of money to pay an independent filmmaker to make a film. And he looked like a young Jim Croce. He had this very soulful eyes, and he paused and he said, listen, man, I'm a storyteller and I want to tell this story. And it just from there was this very aligning of the stars to make this all happen. And philanthropists got involved to fund the film and the premiere. And it premiered about 2 years ago at the University of Buffalo School for the Arts and then on PBS television. It was very difficult in some ways for me to go through the making of the film, but also at the same time, it was very meaningful because I wanted my brother to be remembered not only for the wonderful, bright person he was and loving person, um, but I just didn't want him to be defined by his mental illness and, like so many people with profound mental illness, drug use. So the film was an attempt to, and people often ask about the title, My Brother Lost in Time, A Bipolar Life. I hadn't seen my brother for the last 5 years of his life because he didn't want to see me. We talked on the phone or email or text, but in some way after he died, I was trying to go back in time to our childhoods and really explore the roots of our both of our mental illnesses, and then at the end come out the other side at the end talking about, never stop caring and loving for people with mental illness. So it ended, I hope, on a hopeful note.
It did for sure. And I want to acknowledge the courage it took. I think it takes a lot of courage to go back and to explore a time in your life that was incredibly challenging and to explore it with kindness and care, which came through very much so. It's
Hmm.
coming through now and came through when I watched the film. And one of the themes that also came through and was so meaningful was that people can be carrying certain factors and even trauma. So our past very much comes through into the present. And I see that with people who enter the legal profession. I can personally speak to the fact that, like you, I have, for as long as I can remember, struggled with anxiety and wanting to be perfect, not wanting to make a mistake or the fear of messing up. And that pattern or that habitual tendency to want to be perfect, to not mess things up. It really carried into law school, very much so into the profession when I was working as a litigator, even as I became a much more seasoned litigator, having worked for close to 2 decades and having a great track record of doing really well. So I'm interested to hear from you. How do you see those tendencies interacting with the pressures of legal practice?
Yeah, that's a great question, Courtney, and it's really the intersection of these things. As I teach at the University of Buffalo Law School, I have 50 law students. So I teach law students. I've worked for many years with lawyers, and now I work with judges. So they're like technically three different silos of people in the legal profession, but there's some commonalities,
Yeah,
right? So people come in to the profession before they set foot in law school with the two biggest risk factors for anybody with adult onset depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder is a family history, to be honest, of
yeah,
genetics. They believe about 50% of mood disorders have a genetic load. That doesn't mean it's determinative, but it puts you at higher risk for these kind of illnesses. The
right.
second factor that's very important is our family of origin. And sometimes people think, well, I was never hit or abused by my parents. That's not really the point. It's really that sometimes happens tragically, but it also can be dysfunctional. That can include wounding words and behaviors towards oneself as a child that they know that are about 12 or 13. There's before that time when the brain is developing in a child, there's dramatic structural changes that go on in the brain for children who are exposed to those kind of things. So people come into law school with those kind of things. The latest Gallup poll I just looked at was last year, and it reported that 18%, which is a whopping number, of adults have or are currently being treated for depression. That equates to almost 50 million adults in this country. So there's a crisis even before people step into law school. Then when they get to law school, it's a different kind of training and culture. I think perfectionism is
Yeah,
rewarded in the profession. Some of it is an occupational hazard. There's so much pressure to absorb facts, to write great papers, do well on
yeah,
exams. So it's rewarded maybe in a way different than a lot of other jobs. And then we get into the profession, we start practicing, and it's a combination of the pre-existing factors, certainly perfectionism,
yeah,
which really drives anxiety, and also pessimism. When I've given talks and I talk to my law students, there's a lot of great research by Dr. Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania, who said that he had a great chapter, Why Are Lawyers So Unhappy? And he attributes it to a particular outlook or mindset called pessimism, basically looking at the world in a kind of negative way. And
Yeah.
I think that's, my life as a litigator, that was true. You're always scanning the environment, looking for catastrophes,
Yeah.
problems, so it's part of, uh, it goes with the territory, right? And then I think the third factor that I think is really involved, this collision, uh, is that the high stress loads of being a lawyer of any kind of practice, whether it be trial work, estate planning,
Mm.
um, the numbers are consistent across all practice areas in the largest studies. So I think that what the commonality, though, is a lack of time for self-care, a lack of time with my family or friends.
Yeah.
And that creates the perfect storm, the pre-existing and the post factors, which people get into after law school and after starting to practice.
Yeah, and I know that your second film, which we'll dive into shortly, talks about community, which I think is so important because we can feel so isolated in all of the doing and the preparing and the studying that takes place not only in law school but well into the profession. And the fact that you're giving voice to these factors that make us more apt to maybe fall into this doom and gloom or struggle with anxiety, depression. I think the awareness piece to know what you're getting into, to know maybe from a genetic standpoint what the propensity is to maybe experience depression or be that much harder on yourself. So I think the awareness piece is very important. And I also think when you're talking about sort of the environment of law school and into the legal profession, we're conditioned to do more and more to the point where our to-do list, I feel like, often feel endless. And that can also result in us feeling like we're not doing enough or we're not
Mm.
enough. Even when we're working a gazillion hours and we're getting great outcomes in so many of our cases, we keep pushing through. It comes from a good place. I think that we care. We want to get a great outcome for our clients and we want to be well respected by those that we're working together with or for. But to your point about self care, in all of the grinding out and pushing and doing that we do, what often gets left out of the equation is this time for self care. So I'm curious if you can explain how awareness can
Mm.
begin to shift that sort of pattern that I think becomes so ingrained in the life of a legal professional.
Well, I think there's many ways to come to awareness. Certainly, your wonderful work in teaching mindfulness meditation practices to lawyers and others, I think is an important thing because one of the things when we try to raise our awareness level is it helps us recognize, okay, maybe this isn't so good for me.
Yeah,
Maybe I'm not getting enough sleep. Is this the direction I want to go in my life? And when you're constantly jumping from one crisis and catastrophe to another, you don't stop and pause. And it becomes mechanized, it becomes drudgery, it becomes you're chronically exhausted. So that's one way I think of what you're talking about to come to awareness and recognize you have choices.
yeah,
Oftentimes, that can often happen, and it often does in the legal profession because of the heavy stigma load. I think what often happens, and it certainly did for me, a crisis of some kind, a breakdown of some
yeah.
kind, the wheels fall off, and lawyers find they can't go on anymore.
That was my
Breaks.
that was my experience as well. So it's something very traumatic or significant that you kind of the brakes are, whether you want them to or not, they're put on.
Well, I think that lawyers have a high tolerance for pain, physical and mental pain. And you could say, well, that's kind of dysfunctional, but like pessimism and perfectionism, it's rewarded in the profession. We're
Right.
rewarded to do that. Certainly not all law firms or public service organizations or the government sector. I'm not saying that's true for all of them, but I'm saying, it's true for too many of them,
Yeah.
and I think we're seeing a direction locally, nationally, certainly with law firms and law schools, in the judiciary where I work, in the direction of recognizing, okay, this is not sustainable.
Right.
That was the conclusion and opening line from the ABA National Task Force on Mental Health and Wellbeing, uh, the 2016 survey of 13,000 lawyers, and then the actual report in 2017. Whatever we're doing that's creating these poor results of mental health and well-being, it's not sustainable. And I think that is an important message. Maybe the most important message out of the task force is that thinking about how does that apply to me? Is the
Yeah.
life I'm living unsustainable, at least when it comes to my mental and physical health? And I think for too many lawyers or law students and maybe even judges, it's not.
Yeah, that was my experience. I say I like hit a wall and I realized I can't continue on like this. And it was my oldest son, who was maybe a mere 3 or 4 years old, who he even picked up on that. And he was in many ways a big part of why I realized this isn't sustainable long term. I can't stay in this profession carrying on this load in this way. But I want to circle back to something that you mentioned because it's something that showed up in my life. And I think it was a big reason why I pushed off seeking out help for as long as I did. And it's stigma. You mentioned it a short while ago, and you mentioned it in the film. And you talk about how the root of the word stigma means wound, and that really hit home for me. I know in my personal experience, when I was working as a litigator, I was expected to be a pit bull in court, and I was afraid to let my colleagues, let alone my bosses, know that I was really struggling with anxiety and I was feeling overwhelmed. I wanted them to think that I was their person, that they could keep relying on, and I was going to do good work and I wasn't going to let them down. And so I continued to push through because I was afraid of that stigma. So, can you share with us more about what you've seen and how stigma impacts people who are already struggling?
Well, I think that when also, and I think that's a better description, we should use it more often. Rather, stigma is such a term we throw around and we've heard a million times, and it's a psychological term. And what does it mean? It really means wounding somebody, which is a sense of this sense of silence and shame. Most people fear being you know, ostracized or shamed for their behavior. That's one of the things that drives lawyers for not no help seeking behavior. They don't want to do that for fear out of and if I did confront this in myself, what does that mean for my life? What does it mean for
Yeah,
my family? What does it mean for my livelihood? So I think that I certainly felt that. I was quote unquote the guy. I was the managing partner. I was a rainmaker, and I thought I just got to keep this train going. And I
yeah,
did. I did until I couldn't anymore.
yeah,
I think my perspective of shame is kind of different than most. I'm looking at it over a 25-year period. I was diagnosed at 40, and I'm 25 now, and I see the incredible improvement or lessening in a certain sense of a stigma. We're much more open as a society and clearly in the legal profession
yeah,
about discussing this. So what I say to law firms or I was at an ABA conference in Louisville, Kentucky, it was last fall. So what I said at that time was, I sense the direction is this, is that there's less shaming, outright shaming, and less silence, but many people feel like, okay, I don't want to shame somebody. I am compassionate. I do care, but I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. So that's the next iteration of this path we're on in dealing with mental health and mental well-being. It's some of it is educating people about this topic. What do you say? What do you do? Or how do you recognize the signs of depression, anxiety, burnout in a friend, in a colleague? And for law firm leadership, how do you address this? I mean, traditionally, for most of the time, HR, human
Yeah.
relations have dealt with this more as a disciplinary issue.
Yeah.
You're not producing, your hours are down, what the hell's going on? It wasn't so much of a coming from a place of empathy or how can we work with you to get this better. I think that is changing, and I see that in the area. I deal nationally with a lot of professional development people at firms, and they want to. There's a willingness to see this more as, okay, we want to help this lawyer.
Yeah.
How can we help them? How would we know what to do? So that is a good development. And I say to
Yes.
them, this is not only the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. Because if you don't address it, and this is really the truth, Courtney, it affects retention at
Yes.
firms. Why I don't want to stay at a firm that doesn't support my mental health, and it affects recruitment. So in this, not only am I taught at University of Buffalo, but I've guest lectured at Harvard, Yale, UPenn, and all those young people care
Yeah.
a lot about mental health, and they who wouldn't. And given the choice between great firm A and great firm B, everything else being equal, they will pick every time the firm that has a robust recognition and support regarding mental health.
That does give me hope because what I saw in my own experience having worked in big law, sometimes, and I don't want to make this a younger versus older,
No,
but
no, no. It's
some of
true.
the more seasoned older attorneys are very set in their ways, and what doesn't really resonate with them, they may not be as open to some of these resources and even educating themselves with how to support the younger generations who from an emotional standpoint, from a psychological standpoint, and from just a skill standpoint, they have real talent, but if they don't feel cared for, if they don't feel supported and they're not being nurtured, they're not able to live a balanced life, then they're not going to want to stay in the workplace. It needs to check the boxes, not just being commended on doing a good job in a case, that it needs to be taking in the bigger picture. So I do feel very hopeful in the work that I do with attorneys, younger, older, in law firms, in corporations. I see more of an openness with the younger generations wanting to have a conversation around this. And I think when there's more conversation, the stigma lowers, that this could be something
Yeah.
that,
Mhm.
I'm not alone, that there's other people who are grappling with this. And when there's more conversation, again, that awareness piece, that sense of support really does come through.
Well, you touched on a great point, this generational divide. And
Yeah.
I think, when I think of this issue in our profession, Courtney, I think of it as like a carnival cruise ship. It takes time to turn a big ship,
Yeah.
and we're moving in the right direction, but it takes time because, and I'm able to talk, I think, to older people because it's hard to believe, but I'm older now, and some crusty people, leadership people.
Yeah.
And, sometimes some of the time they say, listen, I didn't get such special treatment. I wasn't treated with kid gloves. I
Yeah.
wasn't why shouldn't I be crusty and demanding to them and
Yeah.
often treat them poorly, you know? So I say to them, because I'm older and maybe speak to them like, another veteran to veteran, I'll be blunt with them,
Yeah.
and I'll say, listen, you are out of your mind. You are out of your mind because if you think just coming at it from the perspective of billable hours, for example,
Yeah.
that's your bread and butter, right? At Big Law. If you think that your bottom line is not being affected by this, you are out of your mind because it is all the national data tells us this, all the national global data tells us this from things in every sector of society. It
Yeah.
costs the US economy hundreds of billions of dollars a year. So those aren't made up things, you know.
Yeah.
So I think it's pretty much, my what I say to them is get your head out of the sand, look at what's going on around you. And if it's, if you think this is too touchy-feely, uh, this is actually where the rubber meets the road when it comes to the prosperity of your firm.
Yeah, the numbers don't lie. The statistics that you mentioned earlier, they're profound. And what I also think is going to hit home for a lot of the leaders of law firms and other legal organizations is when they release the 10-year update, the report on the ABA study. So while I don't expect the numbers to be better than they were 10 years ago, I think that getting back to the awareness piece, that the more and more we can bring awareness over what's needed to make this work more sustainable, the more people are going to invite folks like us with open arms to share these resources with their teams.
And that's happening nationally, and I come into large firms quite a bit, and I see change. I see these kind of things, and I think that, as the time goes on, those younger lawyers are going to be the older, they're going to be the section leaders, the managing
Yeah,
partners. So this is happening. It's just taking time.
yeah, yeah. I want to segue in a moment to your second film, but before we do, I also want to touch upon something very important that is raised in your first film that we've been talking about, and that is suicide and prevention. For anyone who is listening and maybe struggling, or maybe they're concerned about a colleague or someone else in their life, what are some of the signs or the steps that you wish more people understood?
Well, lots of times there's no science, there is science to it, but lots of times, um, what's troubling, and I've run a depression support group for lawyers in my community. 25 years ago, I started it, and people think, "Oh, that's a great thing you did, Dan." And sometimes I feel that way, but it's also fair to say, people in my all those years, all those lawyers over years that have been through the support group, we've had people with suicidal ideation. We've had people who've made serious attempts at suicide, and we've lost some members due to suicide. So it's a real deal. Most people with depression, uh, the vast majority, of course, do not attempt or die by suicide. But of those who do die by suicide, about 80% of them are struggling with some profound form of depression. In the legal profession, the rates of depression are 4 times that of the national average, and the rates of suicide are as much as 10 times higher. Uh, so, I think the first thing to do in this regard, in terms of trying to help somebody, is become educated for what some of those signs are. And typically, there will be a change in behavior in terms of someone's coming into work late. They can't get out of bed. They used to have friends and family. They start to drift and isolate themselves more. For some people, they drink or use drugs. For other people, their sleep becomes disordered. So there are behavioral changes that you can see from the outside. And then I think that the question to ask yourself is, should a lot of people don't know if they should talk to someone, or
Yeah,
say, I'm concerned. I think more often than not, the question to ask is after you become educated, am I the right person to talk to my coworker or my friend or my family member? And maybe you're not, or maybe you are, but
yeah,
I think to go into it educated, and this doesn't take a lot of time. There are plenty of websites that will walk you through or videos about what's the best way to do it. Certainly not being judgmental, but saying
yeah,
things like, I'm just concerned. I've noticed that, you're sleeping more, you're coming into work late. And then for somebody going through suicidal ideation and or attempts, that much more serious thing, certainly crisis service hotlines 24/7, that's a good thing. Seeking out, and this can come in many forms. Maybe for some people, Courtney, they'll seek out their rabbi or their priest or their imam if they're Muslim, or 80% of antidepressant medications are prescribed by primary care providers. So people sometimes might not think of that. They might think, oh, I got to go to a psychologist or psychiatrist, and not
right.
necessarily true because PCPs are trained in recognizing depression. So I think there's a much, much greater awareness of suicide prevention. And I think that when treatment goes up, stigma goes down and people
Yeah.
seek treatment.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'll make sure to share in the show notes the number for the crisis line as well. So I want to transition to your second film, Travels with George, which I so very much loved. I know before we started recording, I told you that I was early for my son's dentist appointment earlier this week, and we were sitting in the car. My oldest son is 15. He equally loved this short film. So I highly encourage younger, older, all generations to really give this a watch. So your second film opens us to a beautiful shift from loss to connection. Can you share how your relationship with George began and what that connection has meant in your own healing?
So 10 years ago, I was myself going through a depression, a kind of significant depression. It wasn't going away. I had the love and support. I have a wonderful family. I had a great therapist. I was on medication, but something was lacking in me. Something, and I don't know or fully explain how, what it was. I was searching for something. I felt the lack of connection. I felt lonely a lot, to be honest.
Yeah.
Uh, so a friend of mine said, you should think of, volunteering or being a service to this place called St. Luke's Mission, which is located on the East Buffalo, which is the poorest of the poor, most segregated part of our community. Heavily, a lot of Black and Latino people, refugees live there. St. Luke's Mission was founded 30 years ago by this amazing woman named Amy Betros, and that's what they do. They serve about 1,000 meals a day to homeless and poor people. So I went there thinking, okay, I'll volunteer in some way. And I said, how can I do it? And they said, well, we have this child named George. He's 9 years old. He's a Black child, and his dad left when he was born, and we got disconnected for a second. I did.
Yeah, I hear you now and you're clear and you got disconnected when you said that when his dad left or
Okay.
passed. Yeah.
Yeah, so George's dad, for whatever reason, left when he was born. So they said he needed a mentor. So when
Yes.
I first met George, we went out. It didn't go so well, and he didn't want to be with me. And then he wouldn't talk to me. He would kick me. I thought, man, uh, I don't know if I want to keep doing this. And I
That's
don't
what
think
came.
he,
In
yeah.
the film, I'm thinking you could have just thrown the towel in right there, but you didn't. You didn't.
Yeah, I guess because not because of any great virtue of my own, but you know, I don't have a good explanation for why I stayed or why George stayed, to be
Yeah.
honest.
Yeah.
But somehow we kept going, and things started to get better and better and better. And we faced our own challenges in our individual lives, but also in our relationship. As time went on, we became closer and closer and closer. And today he's 19, almost 20. He works at Starbucks. He's in a training program. And, you know, when we went to make the film, it's the same filmmaker who, after the first film, said, to me, "What's our next film?" And I said, "I don't have any gas left in the tank. I don't know about that." He goes, "Well, what about your relationship with George?" So I thought, okay. And so we set up a meeting in this old Greek restaurant. It was the filmmaker, myself, and George. And the filmmaker pitched the idea. And George seemed really interested. But then
Yeah.
we're driving home, and I said, George, listen, man, you don't have to do this. You don't have to do this film.
Yeah.
I mean, if, some people will look at it as like, okay, there's this quote unquote successful lawyer, white guy from the suburbs rescuing this black kid in the inner city. Some people may take it that way. You don't have to do any of this.
Yeah.
So he paused and he thought, he goes, that's not the truth. So he goes, I want to tell this story and I want to talk about this. And I was really not surprised, but it was really a beautiful moment between the two of us about the truth, of our
Yeah.
relationship and his willingness, to tell the story.
Yeah. That definitely came through, and your special connection. And I was so moved. There's so many moments where I was moved, but I imagine that after the passing of your brother, getting back to the loneliness, it was clear when you were speaking during the film of how lonely of a time that was, how much hurting you had, and then to hear when George came behind you. I think you were in the church, and the organization had put together uh, a ceremony in light of your brother's passing, and without you even knowing, George showed up and placed his hand on your shoulder. And it was palpable, just feeling that touch. I mean, I didn't obviously feel the physical touch, but that touch of care and true connection that you so strongly have between the two of you. So I think that it speaks to the power of connection. And I also think what you're sharing speaks to the significance of loneliness in the legal profession, that it is the conditions kind of set us up for feeling lonely. I'm wondering if you can touch upon that a bit, because outwardly we can look like such high functioning successful attorneys, but deep down inside, what's not seen many a times is a deep sense of loneliness.
Well, I think when I think of that, I think of to feel a genuine connection, we have to be vulnerable. We have to let our guard down. We have to admit maybe we don't have our shit together all the time.
Yeah.
And that's very tough for lawyers to do. But as a consequence of that, they feel profoundly lonely a lot. And there's a
Yeah.
lot of recent data to suggest that much more lonely than that. I think that one of the most recent surveys and studies found the loneliest profession. But I must say at this time, one of the things I do with my law school class is the first thing I do is an opening statement. And at the end of the semester, I do my closing argument. And in the opening statement, the first thing I say, I'm not here to say, don't go into law. Law is terrible. Being a trial lawyer is awful.
Yeah.
I say to them, some of the best times of my life have been as a lawyer in serving clients, in my making friendships with colleagues, people on the other side of the aisle,
Yeah.
judges, like,
Yeah.
so that's not the point. And, and certainly with the topic of loneliness, I'm not saying, oh, don't go into the law or, because it's a lonely profession. I
Yeah.
think what the better part of the conversation you and I are having is that there's ways to address this, right? There are solutions. And I think that if anything, I think if I can in tiny, tiny way lead by some example, I guess, I wish I had waited this long, to find that connection with someone like George. But I think, if I can do it, you can do it. And
Yeah.
it can come in many ways. At your job, one of the recommendations of the National Task Force is to see your job and what you do at your firm as a form of service, right? It's just not about you, right? And that's a good instinct, when it's balanced with time for self-care. So
Right.
that's not a bad instinct, that's a good instinct.
Yeah.
But outside of work, most people will say, I don't have the time. Dan, I would love to do something like
Yeah.
that, but I don't have the time. I have kids, I have a career. That's okay. We could think of service in a different way. One of the ways I often think, when you wake up in the day, this sounds simple. This sounds like it doesn't impact, but it does. Simple acts of kindness, simple acts of connection. Now, when I go into my Starbucks, everybody knows me. It's kind of like Norm from Cheers. They said, "Oh, good morning, Dan." And I have my own table. They actually, baristas will say, "You can't sit at that table because Dan's coming in," because I made a point of looking them in the eyes. How are you doing today? Oh, Dan, how are you doing? These
Yeah.
small acts of interaction. And then when I make the observation, I'll look at the rest of the people, in line. They're not looking at them. They're looking at their phones, or there's
Yeah.
no eye contact, or there's
Yeah.
no nothing. There's no even, lots of times, not even thank you or anything. So I
Yeah.
think we miss out on those opportunities. I mean, this was highlighted by COVID, right? Where people couldn't have, not even forget about for a second big relationships, but
Yeah.
those little tiny everyday encounters with big law. I say, think about, how do you treat your support team? How do you treat do you even know what's going on in their lives? And this
Yeah.
is not a huge investment of time.
I love how you talk about these small moments of real humanity. I think that that human touch and connection, even little moments, they add up. And in the work that we do as legal professionals, we become more human doings rather than human beings. We're like
Mhm.
machines. And to your point about vulnerability, I think that we fall into this autopilot of constantly doing, being machine-like, that
Yeah.
we lose touch with our sense, or we're afraid to be vulnerable. But there was something that I believe she's the CEO of the organization. Is it pronounced Compeer?
Compere.
Compeer, Sherry Alvarez. She's she shared something that really hit home for me. It's something that I see come through in the foundational program I teach, the mindfulness-based stress reduction program. It's something that comes through the CLEs and the workshops and the multi-week programs that I teach. And she said, pure connection helps people feel like they belong, that they're accepted, and that they're not alone. And I think when one person, even just one person in a room of 100, can be willing to get vulnerable and to share, that it helps others to realize that they're not alone. But when we're so tied up on our phones, when we're in our own worlds, when we're not even looking somebody in their eyes, that we can feel very separate. We can feel like we're in our own world. So I'm wondering, what do you think a sense, or why do you think a sense of belonging is so critical when it comes to mental health.
Well, I think of it this way, Courtney. We as humans evolved in clans or small social groups and for survival, but then, as we evolved as mammals, the sense of human connection gave us a sense of belonging and safety and love. And when people were not part of those clans or small groups, when they were ostracized, uh, people can die of loneliness. Children growing up, babies wither when they're not part of a family or connected to their parents. So we have this, we're hardwired for connection, right?
Yeah.
And when we do that, we flourish. And when we don't do that, we wither,
Mhm.
right? So, for a lot of people, I think of it this way: therapy, medication sometimes, support groups sometimes. That's the trifecta according to psychological research in terms of recovery from any mental health condition. But the sense of connection in your immediate family, your community, your extended family is important because I believe what it does, it speaks to the integrity, the dignity of each human being. And you mentioned earlier, Courtney, about humanizing, rehumanizing oneself. And that's at the heart of that. When we're human, truly human, there's a sense of dignity, there's a sense of alignment with our values, and we see that in other people. And that brings us closer together. And we need that just as much as we need food and water. And when we don't have it, trouble happens, especially with lawyers, like I said earlier, the perfect storm.
Yeah. Yeah. I do. I think there's real power to when we can be human and see that we're in this thing together, rather than having to compare ourselves. This one's better, or this one's not like me. I'm the only one who's suffering. When we can know that we're truly in this together, that makes us stronger as a team. And when workplaces can provide education and the support and resources to help cultivate more of that togetherness, that's what empowers the collective organization. That's how getting back to what you were saying earlier about retainment and engagement and success of businesses, it's to feel that sense of connectedness and that togetherness. So it's all so very powerful and interconnected. Are there any ways that you think the profession as a whole can change right now, so that the perfect storm for mental health challenges, that we can take proactive steps so that the the support is really there and we can in positive ways promote a healthier workplace culture?
Well, it's one of the things that's interesting in that is I call it the Sunday night dreads.
Mm,
When I was a litigator, I would long for Friday nights or Saturdays especially,
yeah.
or the beginning of vacation as opposed to the end of vacation because I knew what was
Yes.
coming. So I think that sometimes lawyers individually or collectively walk around inside of themselves, not only with anxiety or loneliness, but a sense of dread. And I think that when we're really, really honest, I think, what is that about? I think I've said this maybe out loud. I think people find it funny, but it's true. Lawyers have the greatest imaginations, dream lives of any profession I've ever met. And what that means is secretly, or they'll tell me, oh, I want to open a bookshop. I want to open a coffee shop, a pastry. I want to move to Hawaii and be like Jimmy Buffett. Now, what that says to me is that there's this secret part of lawyers, this secret life inside of them, where what they really fear is, what if I were really honest with myself and simply ask myself the question, am I happy? I think a lot of people are afraid to go there because what is the consequence of that? I mean, we have so many people around us, rightfully or wrongfully, who maybe financially depend on us, our spouses, our children, our lifestyle, our house. What would that mean to change course in your 30s, 40s, 50s? So, but to not do that, to not have that conversation or share that is a mistake because what happens, it just gets stuffed and repressed, and it manifests itself in physical illness, psychological illnesses. So I think the truth won't destroy you, right? It's these secrets that can destroy you. And,
Right.
confronting these questions doesn't mean oh, I have to quit being a lawyer, or, maybe it means changing your practice area. Maybe you have a different role at the firm. For me, I left life as a managing partner and a litigator and became of counsel to a firm.
Right.
So there's solutions to this, but we have to have first honest conversation with ourselves, and it's okay to admit these things, and then with significant others. And
Yeah.
there's no way around it, right? It's almost like saying, you know, okay, I know smoking is a problem, but I want to keep doing it. I
Right.
mean,
And when our lives are as full as they are working in the legal sector, oftentimes we don't apply the brakes to give ourselves the space to even turn inward and to be curious. And because we're often very rigid with ourselves, we're so used to setting up a certain outcome that we want to achieve, and nothing's going to steer us off course. We have to be willing to understand that it may not be a straight course, that there may need to be some wiggle room, or we may need to take the off ramp. And that's hard. I know I struggled. I
me too.
wanted I wanted to be on one track, and I knew what I was working towards, and to kind of mess that up, getting back to the perfectionism, it felt scarier in some ways than just pushing through. But it's it's important, to getting back to the awareness piece, to also recognize how we are towards ourselves, the attitude with which even if we dip our toe in the water, to explore this with kindness, with care, because we can be incredibly critical of ourselves. But when we can, I sometimes say, and this came through in your first film about your brother, my brother lost in time, when we can go back to when we were children. And if we can imagine ourselves even as young child, like as a young child, or if we were talking to a child of our own, or a friend, but can we approach ourselves and our own challenges with that sense of compassion and gentling? And I think that's really hard. I think in the legal profession, we're often conditioned to be anything but gentle with ourselves. So
I think
so
that's true.
yeah, I would say that the way in which we explore and pay attention can really help and be supportive in exploring what we have, what other choices there are.
Well, I often say you can do, they're not mutually exclusive, right? You
Yeah,
can take even maybe in the beginning small acts of kindness to yourself. It doesn't mean that you don't have to be in a courtroom and do your job. I'd often say to myself, it's funny, a lot of litigators can identify with this, and I'd say 90% of the time, I would take the high road, treat people with respect and dignity or whatever.
yeah,
10% when I practiced in New York City, opposing counsel, no effect on them. They would be an asshole no matter what I did. I'd go to shake their hand, they wouldn't shake my hand. I go to do something, they would blow up at a deposition, no
yeah,
matter how conciliatory I became.
right,
So, one of the ways in which I think it really was tough for me, Courtney, was when I had to put uh, my war mask on
yeah,
and pull out a like a weapon, like a
Yeah.
club.
Yeah.
And I could do it. And I think what I would say to young lawyers or people in law school, if you're going to go into something, you got to have the capacity to bring that
Yeah.
because there will be people who will not respond to looking back on it, most people do respond to that, and
Yeah.
I'll say, listen, I get what you're trying to do. We both have a job to do. There doesn't have to be this animosity, though, personal. So
Mm.
most people, most lawyers well, maybe even welcome that. But
Yeah.
I think what I would found, given my own trauma in my past, when I bring out that monster inside of Dan, it reminded me of my father, who was like a monster. He was a alcoholic, often violent, died of alcoholism when I was 19. So I think that I think when I look back on it, it's funny. I was a perfectionist. I was an overachiever, and all those things. But I think, for me at least personally, what I most dreaded was conflict. It's comical because I was a litigator, but I mean, when I'm honest with myself, that's where I had the biggest dread or trouble or problems. And for someone like me, I think it was hooked up with my childhood of trauma.
I this resonates with me. I mean, I too worked as a litigator, and I say I would 9 times out of 10 prefer to use my mind. I call it mindfulness magic, to resolve a case amicably. But don't mistake my kindness for being
Exactly.
a pushover. That if 90 to 95% of the time I'm going to be civil and kind, but there's also that side of me. It doesn't come
It
out a
has to,
lot, but
it
you have to
has to
have it.
happen,
Yeah.
and I think the way that I would interpret it, two ways, one of which clearly it was linked to my trauma in my past, but second of all, listen, you're not going to bully me or my client. And that's a healthy thing. It's almost like
Yeah.
a parent protecting your child.
Right.
I
Right.
think that's a healthy thing. But I will say, given who I am, I had, I had, it took a lot out of me. I think that's
Yeah.
fair.
Yeah.
And that part was not good. And cumulatively, I think with trial lawyers, but all lawyers, there's a cumulative effect. In mindfulness, we talk about karma. It's like every act, word, thought, emotion is somehow recorded in our bodies, in our brains, in our
Yeah. Yeah.
memories. And over time, uh, whether for better or for worse, it has its effects. There's just no way around that.
Yeah. And we can be tough in our respectful ways mindfully. There's a way to go about it where we're responding skillfully for ourselves, standing up for what we believe in, standing up for our clients and protecting them as aggressively as we can. But with awareness, we don't have to react and react in unskillful ways.
That's the
So I
power of mindfulness too.
yeah, yeah. So I'm glad you acknowledge that there's that piece where we can stand up for ourselves, for our clients, but we can do it mindfully. So I want to, before we close out the episode, I would love to share with anyone who's listening today who maybe is struggling, whether that's with stress, anxiety, depression, or just feeling overwhelmed, whether it's professionally or the state of the world. What would you want them to hear?
Well, let's speak to lawyers because we're both lawyers, and I think that many lawyers don't know that in each state there's a lawyer's assistance program, which is free, and they provide support and guidance, resources, referrals. That's important. That those are statewide organizations that serve all the bar communities. But then local bar associations also have robust resources, support groups. That's my depression support group we've had for so many years is run through our Erie County Bar Association. So that those things, those means of support are there. And I think that the other thing is to find community wherever you can, and it could be at your synagogue, like I said, or your church or your mosque, but or nature. Nature is the great healer. We don't spend enough time in nature or enough time outside, even if you work
Yeah,
in the city.
yeah.
So
I
one of my
live.
goals is being in nature more.
I have to admit that I sometimes get stuck, and before I know it, I realize it's been hours that I've been glued to my laptop or to some type of device working, and a little bit of time. It doesn't have to cut a major amount of time into our demands, our to-do list, our work, but even just a few minutes, a walk around the block in nature and hearing the sounds and feeling the air, seeing others can be so very
Or even,
nourishing.
what you do, mindfulness, sitting in your office for 5 minutes and just following your breath for 5 minutes has
Yeah,
profound effects.
yeah, for sure. For sure. Well, I really, really enjoyed our time together, and I appreciate the incredible work that you've been doing, that you're continuing to do. I hope that you make a third film because I will be ready and willing to watch the next film
Well,
gladly.
we're talking about a third film, and
Yay.
the third film, we actually, the filmmaker and I said, maybe it's a ripe time to do a larger film about lawyers with and mental health. So much has changed, so much is going on. It's part of that tradition that I've come to believe in with these two films of storytelling.
Yeah,
And because, and God knows I've done this, there's enough PowerPoints, there's enough information. There's enough online, which is all good. But I think that we need to reach people. We need to reach everyone viscerally,
yeah,
on a deeper human level,
yeah.
and for real change to happen.
I know I speak for myself, but your stories, your films, they've touched me in a really powerful way.
Uh,
So thank you for that. And I'll be sure to share the links to the films and the other resources in the show notes. But if people want to learn more about your work or access additional support, can you share with us ways to connect?
Yeah, sure. The best way is there's a contact button on the website, Lawyers with Depression. And there's, guest block. Courtney was a guest of mine, but also national authors, experts. The most recent one currently posted on the website is really exploring with a neuroscientist from Berkeley who wrote a book about the neurobiology of depression. What goes on in the brain? I mean, what goes on there under the
Yeah.
hood? So, from a lot of different perspectives, and there's a lot of resources and things on there, and certainly there's a contact button. That's the easiest way.
Okay. Well, thank you again, Dan. I really appreciate your storytelling, your sharing, and your time here today with us. So thank you again and take the best of care.
Thank you very much, Courtney, and thank you for the work you do, the important work you do.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.